you're all reading the wind wrong. The voice was calm, low, and completely out of place among the electronic beeps and clipped commands echoing across the Delta Force training range. Captain Ryan Holt didn't even look up at first. He was focused on the digital tablet in his hand, studying the ballistic solution scrolling across the screen. Around him, 6 operators lay prone behind precision rifles, their scopes trained on a steel silhouette, sitting 1,400 yards away across a wide stretch of desert terrain. The morning sun hung bright over the Nevada training grounds, heat already beginning to shimmer above the rocky valley floor. Wind flags fluttered along the firing lane, each one telling a slightly different story, and the small crowd of instructors and operators behind the line watched the latest shot miss wide, with a dull metallic echo far beyond the target berm. Holt exhaled sharply. Just 2 clicks left, he said. Another rifle cracked through the dry air. The bullet kicked dust a few feet off the plate. Miss again, someone muttered under their breath. Another operator shook his head and leaned back from the scope. The target had been tormenting them for nearly an hour now, a tiny rectangle of steel barely visible against the distant hillside. The wind was playing tricks through the valley, shifting direction between the ridgelines and the sun-heated rocks. Ballistic computers recalculated again and again, but the rounds still refused to connect. Holt finally stood and rubbed his eyes, frustration creeping into his voice. We're not leaving this range until someone puts steel on that plate. A quiet chuckle drifted from behind the firing line. It wasn't mocking, just oddly certain. Holt turned for the first time. Standing several yards behind the operators was an old man leaning lightly on a black cane. He wore a faded green field jacket, worn blue jeans, and a pair of scuffed brown boots that had clearly seen decades of use. His hair was silver, cut short, and the deep lines on his face suggested a lifetime spent outdoors. One of his legs was supported by a rigid brace that disappeared beneath the denim. The range safety officer hadn't noticed him yet, but several operators had. One nudged another with an elbow. You guys bring your grandpa to sniper school today? Another smirked quietly. The old man didn't react. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the distant target, watching the wind ripple across the dry valley floor. Holt frowned and walked toward him, irritation mixing with curiosity. Sir, this is a restricted Delta training range. The man nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a fact that didn't concern him. Holt gestured toward the distant plate. We're conducting a long-range evaluation. Civilians aren't allowed on the line. The old man studied the ridge for another moment before speaking again, voice steady and almost thoughtful. Your computers are solving the wind where you're lying, he said. Not where the bullet's actually flying. A few operators laughed softly. Holt folded his arms. With respect, sir, these men have the best equipment the military can build. The old man's expression didn't change. He simply watched a gust ripple through a patch of dust halfway downrange. That's the problem, he said quietly. Equipment can't see the second wind rolling off that ridge. Another shot rang out. The round missed again, kicking up dirt short of the plate. The old man tilted his head slightly, as if confirming something he already knew. Behind Holt, one of the younger operators whispered, Did that old guy just call our wind wrong? The old man finally looked at them. Not with arrogance. Not with challenge. Just calm certainty. You're shooting the wrong wind. Captain Ryan Holt stared at the old man for a long moment, the dry desert wind tugging faintly at the brim of his cap. Around them, the Delta operators shifted on the gravel firing line, some still behind their rifles, others sitting back on their heels with expressions that mixed amusement and curiosity. The target plate still stood untouched 1,400 yards away, a stubborn rectangle of steel glinting under the Nevada sun. Holt let out a short breath through his nose. You are telling me, he said slowly, that 6 ballistic computers, 3 wind meters, and a full Delta sniper team are all wrong. The old man rested both hands on the curved handle of his cane and studied the distant ridge as if the conversation were only background noise. I am saying the wind does not care what your computers think, he replied calmly. A few operators chuckled again. One of them, a tall sergeant named Mark Delaney, leaned back from his rifle and called out with a grin. Maybe the old-timer wants to show us how it is. Done. Another voice added. Yeah, maybe he is one of those YouTube experts. The laughter spread quietly across the line. Holt did not laugh, but the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. He gestured toward the valley. Sir, that plate is over 1,400 yards out. The wind is shifting across 3 different ridges. Even experienced shooters are having trouble today. The old man nodded once, as if agreeing with the statement rather than arguing against it. That valley creates 3 winds, he said. Not one. Holt crossed his arms. 3 winds. Yes, the man said. He lifted his chin slightly toward the far hillside. The first one starts about 400 yards out. It rolls down the rock face and drifts right to left. Your flags catch that one. He paused, then pointed with the tip of his cane toward the dry basin halfway downrange. The second wind sits lower in the valley. It moves the opposite direction because the sun heats the sand faster than the ridge. Your bullet flies through that pocket for almost 600 yards. The operators had stopped laughing now. Holt noticed that several of them had quietly turned their heads toward the valley, following the old man's line of sight. The man continued, his voice steady and unhurried. The third wind begins near the target. It drops straight off the cliff face behind the plate and pushes the round downward and left just before impact. One of the younger operators blinked. That is exactly where the rounds are landing, he muttered. Holt looked back at the target through a spotting scope lying on the ground. The missed shots had formed a scattered pattern that suddenly seemed less random than it had a moment earlier. He lowered the scope slowly. You have been watching us for how long? He asked. The old man shrugged slightly. Long enough. A faint gust moved across the range, lifting dust in a slow swirling ribbon across the valley floor. The man watched it carefully, his pale blue eyes following the movement the way a sailor watches shifting waves. Behind Holt, Delaney spoke again, this time without laughter. Captain, the mirage is moving 2 different directions downrange. Holt turned sharply. The operators were leaning toward their scopes again now, studying the subtle shimmer above the ground. The old man remained perfectly still, as if he had already seen everything. He needed to see. Holt glanced back at him, curiosity beginning to push aside irritation. All right, he said slowly. If we are shooting the wrong wind. He gestured toward the rifles resting along the line. Then what wind should we be shooting? The range fell into a strange quiet after Captain Ryan Holt asked the question. The wind still moved through the valley, carrying the faint rattle of dry grass and the distant hum of generators from the base. But the laughter from a few minutes earlier had disappeared. Every operator on the firing line was now watching the old man. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied the terrain again, his pale blue eyes moving slowly across the ridges, the dust trails, the faint shimmering mirage floating above the desert floor. The patience in his posture felt different from the restless energy of the operators. It was the patience of someone who had watched wind for a very long time. Holt waited, arms still folded. Well, he said after a moment, if we are reading the wrong wind, where should the correction be? The old man tapped the rubber tip of his cane lightly against the gravel. Start with the second wind, he said. Several operators frowned. One of them leaned over his scope again. The valley pocket? The old man nodded. That is the one your computers do not see. Holt glanced toward the nearest rifle. Explain. The man pointed toward the sun-baked basin halfway downrange. Your ballistic software measures the air where you are lying. Your wind meters measure what passes through the flags. But the bullet spends most of its flight through that valley pocket. Delaney lowered his face to the spotting scope again. The mirage shimmered across the ground like water on hot asphalt. Captain, he said quietly, the air is bending right to left down there. Holt walked to the rifle and picked up the tablet connected to the ballistic system. The screen displayed numbers, wind values, elevation adjustments, all calculated down to precise decimals. Our system says the primary wind is left to right, he said. The old man gave a faint smile. Your system is watching the first wind. Holt looked up. And the second wind. The old man tilted his head slightly, feeling the air brush across his cheek. Opposite direction, he said. Several operators exchanged glances. One of the younger snipers whispered. That would explain the drift pattern. Holt studied the target plate through the spotting scope again. The cluster of missed impacts suddenly looked less like random error and more like a consistent push. He lowered the scope slowly. All right, he said. Assume you are correct. What correction would you make? The old man did not hesitate. Half a minute right for the valley wind. Quarter minute up for the drop near the ridge. A few operators blinked. One of them quietly recalculated the numbers in his head. That is almost exactly the correction our computers rejected. Holt rested the tablet on the rifle case and looked back at the old man. You sound very confident. The man shrugged slightly. Confidence comes from watching the land. Holt gestured toward the rifles lined along the firing mats. Then show us. The words hung in the air for a moment. Several operators straightened up, suddenly alert. Delaney even sat up from his prone position, curiosity replacing his earlier grin. The old man remained still, as if considering whether the invitation mattered to him at all. Finally, he stepped forward slowly, the brace on his leg shifting slightly beneath his jeans. Holt watched the careful movement, noticing the stiffness in the man's stride for the first time. The old man stopped beside the nearest rifle but did not touch it. Instead, he studied the weapon quietly, his eyes moving over the scope, the stock, the carefully mounted bipod. After a moment, he shook his head gently. Not this one, he said. Holt frowned. Why not? The old man looked down the firing line until his gaze settled on a long cloth-wrapped case resting against a wooden bench several yards away. Because that one belongs to me. Captain Ryan Holt followed the direction of the old man's gaze until he spotted the cloth-wrapped case leaning quietly against the weathered wooden bench near the edge of the range. It looked older than the sleek modern rifles lined along the firing mats, the faded canvas worn thin along the corners and darkened by years of handling. A few of the operators glanced at it, then back at the old man, uncertainty beginning to replace the earlier amusement in their faces. Holt tilted his head slightly. That case belongs to you, he asked. The old man nodded once. It does. The wind shifted again across the valley, stirring dust along the dry basin where the second wind he had described was still flowing unseen to most of the men on the range. Holt studied him for another second, then gestured toward the bench. Go ahead. The old man walked slowly across the gravel, his cane tapping lightly with each step. The brace along his leg moved stiffly beneath his jeans, but his upper body remained steady and balanced, like someone who had long ago learned how to move efficiently despite the injury. When he reached the bench, he set the cane carefully against the wood and rested one hand on the cloth case. For a moment, he simply stood there, as if acknowledging an old companion before waking it from a long rest. Several operators leaned forward slightly, their attention fixed on the quiet ritual. The old man unwrapped the cloth slowly, folding it back with deliberate care until the rifle beneath was revealed. It was not a modern precision system filled with carbon fiber and digital attachments. It was wood and steel. The walnut stock was dark with age, polished smooth by decades of handling. Small scars marked the surface, shallow dents and scratches that spoke of long service rather than neglect. The bolt action carried the familiar simplicity of an older generation of rifles, and the scope mounted on top was compact and practical rather than elaborate. One of the operators blinked in surprise. That is an M40, he said quietly. Another leaned closer. An early one. Holt walked a few steps toward the bench, curiosity now fully replacing irritation. That rifle is older than most of the men on this range, he said. The old man gave a faint nod while checking the bolt with a slow, practiced motion. So am I. A few operators exchanged looks. Delaney crouched slightly to get a better view of the rifle. You still shoot with that? He asked. The old man rested his hand lightly on the stock. It still shoots with me. The answer carried no arrogance, only simple certainty. Holt studied the rifle for another moment before stepping back toward the firing line. All right, he said, if you are willing to demonstrate. The old man lifted the rifle carefully and walked toward one of the empty firing mats. His movements were steady despite the brace on his leg. When he reached the mat, he lowered himself slowly to the ground, positioning the rifle with quiet familiarity, as if the gravel and desert wind around him were part of a place he had known long before the modern training range existed. The operators gathered behind him in a loose half-circle, watching in silence now. The earlier jokes had vanished completely. The old man settled the rifle against the bipod and looked downrange once more toward the distant steel plate, sitting 1,400 yards away beneath the bright desert sky. For a long moment, he did not move at all. He simply watched the wind move across the valley. The desert range remained completely silent as the old man settled behind the rifle. The operators who had been joking only minutes earlier now stood with their arms folded or their hands resting quietly on their own rifles, watching every movement with growing curiosity. Captain Ryan Holt remained just behind the firing line, his eyes fixed on the figure lying calmly on the mat. The old man did not rush. He adjusted the bipod a fraction of an inch, then rested the stock gently into his shoulder as if it belonged there. His cheeks settled against the worn walnut comb, the motion so natural it looked like muscle memory rather than effort. The rifle seemed less like a tool and more like something that had always been a part of him. Through the scope he watched the distant steel plate sitting far across the valley, the tiny rectangle barely visible against the pale hillside. The wind continued to move across the desert floor, invisible currents sliding through the basin and curling along the ridge exactly as he had described moments earlier. The operators watched him study the landscape without touching the trigger. 1 minute passed, then another. A few of the younger snipers shifted slightly and used to the quiet patience. One of them whispered, "What is he waiting for?" Delaney answered softly without looking away. "The wind." The old man finally lifted one hand from the rifle and held it just above the ground beside the mat. Not high into the air like a beginner feeling a breeze, but low where the air brushed across the gravel and dust. His fingers moved slightly, as if reading something written in the wind itself. Then he lowered his hand and returned it to the rifle. Captain Holt noticed something strange in that moment. The old man was not checking equipment. He was not looking at wind meters or digital displays. Everything he needed seemed to exist inside the quiet calculations happening behind those pale blue eyes. The man adjusted the scope turret slowly, 2 soft clicks that sounded unusually loud in the still air. Several operators leaned closer, recognizing that the correction he dialed matched almost exactly the numbers he had predicted earlier. Holt glanced down at the tablet again. The computer still rejected those values. The old man ignored the tablet completely. His breathing slowed until his chest barely moved. The rifle remained perfectly steady on the bipod. The valley wind rolled across the desert floor again, lifting a faint ribbon of dust near the second ridge. The old man watched it carefully through the scope, waiting. A few seconds later the dust settled. The wind flags near the firing line fluttered left to right, but far downrange the shimmering mirage bent the opposite direction. The moment he had been waiting for arrived quietly. The old man exhaled slowly and pressed the trigger. The rifle spoke with a sharp crack that echoed off the distant hills. For a long half-second nothing happened. The operators watched the distant plate through their scopes and spotting optics. Then the sound came back across the valley. A clear metallic ring drifted through the desert air as the bullet struck the steel target dead center. No one spoke. The echo faded into the hills while the steel plate continued to sway gently in the distance. Several operators blinked in disbelief. One of the younger snipers lowered his scope slowly and whispered, "First shot." Delaney did not answer. Captain Ryan Holt remained completely still, staring at the old man behind the rifle. The man had already lifted his head from the scope and was quietly working the bolt with calm familiarity, as if the result had never been in doubt. The metallic ring from the distant steel plate drifted across the desert range and slowly faded into the quiet air. For several seconds no one moved. The operators stood frozen behind the firing line, their eyes still fixed on the small target 1,400 yards away that now swayed gently from the impact. Captain Ryan Holt lowered the spotting scope in his hands with a slow, deliberate motion. The digital tablet beside him still displayed the rejected firing solution, its calculations insisting that the shot should have missed wide left. Yet the plate continued to swing under the bright Nevada sun. One of the younger operators finally exhaled softly. "That was 1,400 yards, he said. Delaney nodded once without taking his eyes off the old man. "First round." The old man behind the rifle did not react to the quiet astonishment spreading along the firing line. He simply worked the bolt with calm familiarity and let the empty casing fall gently onto the mat beside him. The movement was smooth, practiced, almost absent-minded, like someone performing a motion he had repeated thousands of times over the course of a lifetime. Holt stepped closer now, curiosity replacing the earlier challenge in his posture. "That was a lucky correction," one operator muttered behind him, though his voice carried less confidence than before. Another shook his head. "Luck does not read 3 wins." The old man lifted his head slightly from the rifle and studied the valley again as if the shot had been only a small confirmation of something he already understood. The wind continued to slide through the basin in quiet shifting layers exactly where he had predicted. Holt crouched beside the firing mat and glanced at the rifle more carefully this time. The walnut stock showed decades of wear, and near the bolt a long shallow gouge cut across the wood as if the rifle had once been struck by something sharp long ago. His eyes moved to the metal of the bolt handle itself. There, etched carefully into the steel, were two small words and a number worn smooth with age. Holt leaned slightly closer to read it. Titan 3. He blinked once, unsure if he had read it correctly. A few feet behind him, Delaney had noticed the same marking. His expression changed immediately. The easy confidence he carried as a Delta sniper faded into something more thoughtful, almost cautious. "Captain," Delaney said quietly. Holt looked back at him. Delaney nodded subtly toward the rifle bolt. Holt glanced down again. The marking was unmistakable. Titan 3. The words stirred something faint in the back of his memory, something he had heard long ago during a lecture on early special operations history, a story mentioned only briefly before the instructor had moved on. Holt looked up slowly at the old man. The veteran was watching the distant ridgeline again, his attention already drifting back to the wind, as if the reaction behind him was unimportant. Holt straightened to his full height and studied him more carefully now, noticing details he had overlooked earlier. The quiet confidence, the way the rifle seemed perfectly balanced in his hands, the calm patience that no training course could teach. Holt hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Sir," he said, his voice no longer sharp with challenge. The old man turned his head slightly. Holt held his gaze for a second. "What unit were you with?" The man rested his hand lightly on the rifle stock. His answer came calmly, almost as an afterthought. "A long time ago," he said. Holt nodded slowly, but the question that now mattered far more than the first one formed in his mind. He looked down once more at the engraved bolt, and then back at the old veteran standing quietly on the range. "What was your call sign?" The question lingered in the dry desert air for several seconds after Captain Ryan Holt asked it. The operators behind him had all gone quiet again, though this silence felt different from the stunned moment after the shot. This silence carried expectation. The wind continued moving across the valley floor, brushing through the gravel and whispering against the faded wind flags along the firing line. The old man remained seated behind the rifle for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly along the worn walnut stock, as if he were remembering something that had nothing to do with the present-day range. Finally, he lifted his head and slowly rose from the mat. The movement was careful but controlled, the brace along his leg shifting as he stood. He reached down and picked up the cane he had set beside the mat earlier, leaning on it only slightly as he turned toward the group of Delta operators now watching him with a very different kind of attention. Captain Holt held his gaze. "Sir," Holt repeated calmly, "what was your call sign?" The old man studied the valley for another second before answering, as if the wind itself deserved the last word. Then he looked back at Holt. His expression was not proud or dramatic. It was simply matter of fact, the way someone might answer a question about the weather. "Titan 3, he said. The words settled quietly into the air. No one laughed this time. No one even shifted their stance. Several operators exchanged quick glances. Delaney's eyes moved instinctively toward the engraving he had noticed earlier on the bolt of the rifle. Titan 3. Now the marking carried a completely different weight. One of the younger snipers frowned slightly. Titan 3. He repeated under his breath as if testing the name against something half-remembered. Captain Holt did not speak immediately. The call sign echoed faintly in the back of his memory the same way it had when he first saw the engraving. But now the connection felt stronger. He had heard it somewhere before. Not in casual conversation. Not in training manuals. It had been mentioned in one of those quiet historical briefings instructors sometimes gave about the early years of modern special operations. Stories about the units that operated before most official records existed. Stories that were usually followed by a reminder that many details were still classified. Holt slowly crossed his arms, studying the old veteran again. The calm posture. The quiet confidence. The way he had read the wind across 1,400 yards without a single instrument. Holt glanced briefly at Delaney. The sniper was still staring at the rifle bolt with a thoughtful expression. "Captain," Delaney said quietly. Holt nodded once. "I know." The younger operators looked between them, confusion spreading across their faces as they realized something important was happening that they did not yet understand. One of them finally spoke. "What is Titan 3? Holt did not answer him right away. Instead, he looked back at the old man. The veteran had already turned his gaze toward the distant ridgeline again, as if the conversation had nothing to do with him. After a moment, Holt reached for the tablet lying on the rifle case and opened the secure communications application connected to the base network. He typed 2 simple words into the search field. Titan 3. The system paused for a moment while the request traveled through the encrypted network. Then a small notification appeared on the screen. Access restricted. Holt frowned slightly and sent a short message to the operations desk instead. Confirm call signed Titan 3. The reply came faster than he expected. The screen flashed once before displaying a single line of text. Do not disrespect him. Holt looked up slowly from the tablet. The wind moved quietly across the range again. And for the first time that morning, Captain Ryan Holt understood that the old man standing beside the rifle might not simply be a veteran who knew how to read the wind. Captain Ryan Holt stared at the tablet screen for several seconds after reading the message. The simple line of text did not contain a rank, a unit designation, or even a name. It only carried a warning that felt heavier than any classified file. Do not disrespect him. Holt slowly lowered the tablet and looked back toward the old man standing quietly beside the firing mat. The veteran had already stepped away from the rifle and was carefully wrapping the worn cloth back around the wooden stock, as if the entire demonstration had been nothing more than a routine moment on a quiet range. The Delta operators watched him in silence. The earlier curiosity had transformed into something closer to respect, though most of them still did not fully understand why. The wind moved again across the valley, pushing a slow ribbon of dust through the basin where the second wind curled invisibly toward the ridge. Holt glanced toward Delaney, who still stood near the rifle mat with his eyes fixed on the engraving that had started this entire shift in atmosphere. You have heard that call sign before, Holt said quietly. Delaney nodded once. Not in detail, he replied. Just stories. One of the younger operators leaned closer. Stories about what? Delaney hesitated. About someone who could see a battlefield before anyone else understood what was happening. The younger man frowned. That sounds like a myth. Delaney gave a small shrug. Most legends start that way. Holt turned back toward the old veteran. The man had finished wrapping the rifle and was now resting his hand lightly on the cloth case, his cane leaning against the bench again. His attention had returned to the valley and the shifting wind currents that had confused an entire Delta sniper team earlier that morning. For a moment, Holt considered simply leaving the situation as it was, but the message on the tablet still lingered in his mind. Do not disrespect him. He stepped forward slowly until he stood a few feet from the old man. Sir, Holt said calmly. The veteran turned his head slightly. Holt held his gaze. Our operations desk confirmed your call sign. The old man nodded once as if that fact did not surprise him at all. Holt continued, his tone now far more careful than it had been earlier in the morning. They did not provide details. The veteran smiled faintly. They rarely do. Holt studied him for another second. The desert wind brushed lightly across the range again, stirring the wind flags along the firing line in quiet, restless motions. Behind Holt, the operators stood perfectly still, listening to every word. There are not many records about Titan 3, Holt said. The old man rested both hands on the top of his cane. There were not supposed to be. The statement carried no mystery, only simple acceptance. One of the younger operators whispered behind Holt. Captain, who exactly is he? Holt did not answer right away. Instead, he glanced once more at the tablet in his hand. A second message had appeared on the screen while he was speaking. This one contained only 3 words. General Hale, incoming. Holt slowly looked up from the screen toward the access road leading to the range. In the distance, beyond the dust drifting across the desert floor, a black military vehicle had just turned through the gate and was moving quickly toward the firing line. Holt lowered the tablet again and looked back at the old man standing calmly beside the bench. For the first time that morning, Captain Ryan Holt realized that the quiet veteran might not have come to the range by accident at all. The black military vehicle rolled across the desert road and came to a stop near the edge of the range, its tires crunching slowly over the gravel. The Delta operators instinctively straightened as the door opened, and a tall officer stepped out into the bright Nevada sunlight. Lieutenant General Marcus Hale carried himself with the calm authority of someone who had spent a lifetime around soldiers and battlefields. His eyes moved across the firing line quickly, taking in the rifles, the operators, and finally the old man standing quietly beside the wooden bench. The wind moved softly across the valley again, stirring the flags and lifting dust along the distant basin. Captain Ryan Holt stepped forward and snapped to attention. The other operators followed his lead. General Hale returned. A brief nod, but did not speak immediately. His focus had already locked on the old veteran. For several seconds the two men simply looked at one another across the range. Then the general walked forward, his boots steady on the gravel until he stopped a few feet in front of the man with the cane. The operators behind Holt watched closely, sensing that something important was about to happen even if they did not yet understand what it was. The old veteran did not move or salute. He simply rested both hands on the top of his cane and regarded the approaching officer with the same calm expression he had worn all morning. General Hale studied him carefully, his face softening with recognition. Slowly, with deliberate precision, the general raised his right hand in a formal salute. The motion was crisp and unmistakable. The Delta operators froze. Captain Holt felt the shift in the air immediately. A general did not salute civilians, and he certainly did not salute them first. The old man watched the salute for a moment, then returned it with a small nod of his head rather than a military gesture, as if the formalities of rank had never mattered very much to him. General Hale lowered his hand and smiled faintly. "It has been a long time," he said. The old veteran shrugged slightly. "The wind still moves the same way." A quiet ripple of confusion passed through the operators behind Holt. The younger snipers exchanged glances, trying to piece together the moment unfolding in front of them. Captain Holt stepped forward carefully. "Sir," he said to the general, "we confirmed the call sign." General Hale nodded without looking away from the old man. "Yes," he replied calmly. Holt hesitated before asking the question that had been building since the first message appeared on the tablet. "Who is Titan 3? General Hale finally turned to face the Delta operators. His expression was calm, but carried the quiet gravity of someone explaining a piece of history. "Before most modern special operations units existed," the general said, "there were a few individuals who shaped how we understand long-range reconnaissance and battlefield awareness." He gestured toward the old veteran standing beside the bench. He was one of them. The operators remained silent as the meaning settled in. Holt looked again at the worn rifle case, the engraving on the bolt, and the calm man who had read the wind better than an entire Delta sniper team. The old veteran picked up the cloth-wrapped rifle and rested it easily against his shoulder. He gave the range one last glance, watching the valley winds move across the desert floor. Then he turned and began walking slowly toward the road, the brace on his leg shifting quietly with each step. No one stopped him. The Delta operators simply watched in silence as he disappeared into the bright desert sunlight. And long after the dust settled on the range, the faint metallic ring of that single shot still seemed to echo across the valley, a quiet reminder that true legends rarely need to introduce themselves.